Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Hensi Tanrin Sawyer. Thank you for joining me today. I'm going to be talking about bereavement, loss, and grief. I know this is a very difficult topic to address. This is a very difficult topic to talk about. There is no way that you can talk about this, because when you're talking about grief, when you're talking about bereavement, especially to a client, if you haven't been through grief, I don't know if you would understand what that grief the person is going through, except you experience some kind of loss or bereavement. For me, when I work with clients who go through grief or bereavement, I do understand where they're coming from because it's something I've also suffered in my life before. There are different types of grief and bereavement and loss that people go through. There's times where a client is talking about their loss. You just feel for that. You want to be able to put yourself in their shoes and see where they're coming from. So today I'll just be talking about loss and bereavement and grief. In terms of loss, it could be anything. It could be loss of a property, or loss of an item, loss of a friendship, the breakup of a friendship, or it could be the loss of a human being, or a pet, or anything that means a lot to you, or it could be an object. People do get attached to their objects. People do get attached to their pets. It could be loss. It could be maybe the death of a loved one, and you just so grief stricken with the memory of that person dying, or the loss of that someone who has passed away. It can be really devastating. So today I'm going to try as much as possible to talk to you through briefly through grief counseling from my own perspective. Everybody works differently. I'm just talking about my own perspective, okay? And try and see if I can encourage you guys. All right, I'm just gonna look through my notes. In 2020, I lost my dad during the COVID. My dad didn't die from COVID, but he passed away in 2020, and I found that period really difficult because I had to go into therapy myself to be able to explore my own feelings about what I was going through. And after that, took 5 weeks off work and came back to work, and also counseling those who were going through their own bereavement during that time of COVID. It was a very difficult period, but I'm glad that I was also there for people. I want to suggest that if you're going through grief or loss, speak to someone. Please speak to someone. Speak to someone who is a professional, in a professional setting, or speak to your loved ones, speak to your friends about what you're experiencing, and see that comfort and how they can help you. I do understand that sometimes you might not want to speak to somebody because you feel they don't understand you and you want to isolate and be on your own. That's fairly normal. But I also want to encourage you to speak to someone that you feel might understand. Okay? Don't isolate yourself. Talk about it sometimes with someone. And also look for how you want to grieve, how you want to grieve. Think about that, which I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so there are 5 stages of grief. You have that denial stage where it's a stage where you refuse to accept the loss that has occurred. When you have that loss, you might deny that loss has happened or that situation has happened. Usually when somebody dies, there is that initial shock that we all experience. You know, even though the person, you might know that the person is passing away if they were ill, but there is that shock. There's also times where the person passes away suddenly from one incident on the other. There is that shock. You know, we can't believe. I remember when my dad passed away, even though I knew he, you know, there was times where I knew that, okay, dad was going to pass away because he was so ill, and the doctor said there was nothing they could do. I wasn't really expecting for him to pass away when he did. You know, I was in my counseling room here when I got the phone call to say dad had passed away. It crushed me. I was devastated. I was shocked that, oh my goodness, my dad is really gone. You know, so we go through that initial shock of that loss. And it could be a person, it could be anything, or it could be a pet. Okay. The next stage that we experience is anger. And that anger is where we begin to ask ourselves what has happened. Feeling that anger, it could be geared towards somebody else or towards ourselves. You know, feeling that this is unfair. Why did this person die? Or why did I lose this relationship? Or why did I lose this friendship? Or why have I lost my pet? This is unfair. So that feeling of anger. Or we get angry at God and say, oh God, why did you take my loved one? You know, we look for something to get angry at, and we turn our anger to God. It's not as if God has done anything wrong, but as human beings, we turn because we're looking for someone to get angry at. Another stage is the bargaining stage, where we're trying to change or delay the loss that we feel and wanting the loss to return into its previous state as if it never occurred. So let's say you lost somebody and you're wishing that that person, even though you knew that person, you know that person has passed away, you're wishing that the person didn't pass away. You're wishing, oh, I wish I could get the person, or seeing that person in that original state, wanting the person to return to you. No, dad hasn't passed away. Oh no, you know, that particular issue or that loss of friendship, you know, trying to restore or wanting that friendship to come back when you know it's actually ended. And then we get into a state of depression, which is another stage of grief. Depression is a deep state of sadness that we recognize. When we recognize that our loss is real, we begin to experience that deep state of sadness. You may start to isolate yourself or experience prolonged times of crying and sadness. You know, as you grieve, that prolonged state of sadness, as you begin to grieve, it will begin to show up. You want to isolate yourself. You don't want to be around anyone. You want to cry all day and feel sad all day. And then the last stage of grief, is acceptance. And this is when you allow yourself to come to terms with your loss by accepting it. You're beginning to understand the situation logically and coming to terms with it emotionally. This can be difficult for people. I know that it took me a while for me to begin to really accept that, oh yeah, dad's gone, he's not coming back. And I felt, okay, what is my next step? What would dad want me to do? So after working on myself and, you know, going to therapy helped me to process. When I was in counseling, it helped me to process my emotions about how I felt about my dad and how I felt about his funeral, and then slowly working. But you see, everyone is different. I'm just saying my own experience, but everybody is different. So you see how you feel and take it according to how you feel. Okay. Another thing I've written here is the grief process, the grieving process. When you're grieving, when you're going through that bereavement and loss, there's a process that your emotions and that your body is going through. You will notice the physical symptoms, you will notice the emotional symptoms, and I'm going to talk through it to you with you today. So there is acute grief, complicated grief, and integrative or integrated grief. Integrated grief. Okay, I hope I pronounced that right. Okay, let's talk about acute grief. So in terms of acute grief, immediately after the loss or months afterwards, you begin to experience shock, distress, sadness, poor appetite, sleep problems, poor concentration, and these can diminish over years for some people. But when there's that loss, immediately or after, you begin to experience different symptoms. So I would say try and be self-aware of what it is you're feeling. And I know how grief can be so painful that with the loss of your loved one, you might not even be concentrating on what you're feeling. But these are the processes so that you can watch out for them. Now, complicated grief is where the loss feels so unreal and you're unable to cope. It's unmanageable. You yearn for the person, and you feel guilty about moving on. There's some people that say, you know what, I've lost this person. I feel guilty. If I move on with my life, I don't want to move on. If I move on with my life, I just feel guilty about doing so. If you think about a loss, maybe you've gone through a divorce, that loss of that relationship. Some people say, well, I don't want to move on. I want to still grieve this relationship. And it could be the loss of a loved one, maybe a husband or a wife. Either one of the other passes away, and the other person say they can't move on because they feel guilty if they remarry, so they stay in that grief. Now, integrated grief is, see, I managed to pronounce it right, integrated grief, is accepting the reality of the loss. You begin to accept that reality. You resume your daily duties in life. It doesn't mean that you don't miss the loved one. You still miss the loved one, but you're learning to cope day by day. Acute grief may also show up sometimes, maybe during the anniversary or birthdays or any kind of reminders. You begin to remember, oh, I wish that loved one was here, or I wish that relationship was still around. So that can come in from time to time. Also, when I'm working with clients in regards to grief, I normally say to them to really recognize what emotions they are feeling. So here are some of the emotions that you will feel when you're experiencing any type of loss: shock, denial, disorientation, feeling restless, anxiety, the feeling of fear, guilt, lack of concentration, shame, sadness, depression, doubt, loss of confidence. And when you're working through your grief, you can also at a later stage begin to experience acceptance. You're testing it, testing reality and see, okay, has this person really died over time? And then you begin to say, okay, how can I let go? And how can I renew my confidence? Right? So if you identify with loss, if you identify with grief, or bereavement, I'm gonna give you some few tips on how to cope. Now, like I said, everyone is different. You've just got to find out for yourself how you can manage. And so for some people, it takes years before they get out of that grieving stage. For some people, they get out of it quickly. Some people, they just lock those emotions and don't want to grieve. Or some people just feel, you know what, let me grieve when I want to. Whatever that stage is for you, it's fine. But this is how I have been able to grieve and cope, and I want to share that with you and see if it's something that you can put into practice for yourself. Okay, all right. Ways to grieve, how to cope. First of all, is for you to sit down and assess your well-being. Assess your well-being in terms of self-care, your physical care, emotional, psychological, social, spiritual, and professional care. Well-being, you need to make sure you think about those times, because I know when you're grieving, sometimes it's difficult to eat, it's difficult to take care of yourself. You don't want to shower, you don't want to get out of bed. Depression begins to set in. You cry, you miss those people. It can be devastating. It can be, and I do understand. A way to help you process. Think of how you want to process the death of your loved one, or the loss of your loved one, or the loss of whatever you feel that you're grieving about. You can decide to write a letter. You can decide to write a goodbye letter. Ask yourself, how would I want to process the loss that I'm feeling? How do you want to grieve? How do you want to grieve is what I'm asking. How would you want to grieve this lost one, your loved one? Note, what feeling or emotion do you experience about your loss? So the loss that you're going through, what emotion or what feeling are you experiencing? Are you able to recognize what emotion is attached to the loss you're grieving? So for example, if you're grieving and you're angry, do you know why you're angry? What is it you're angry at? So for me, I normally say to clients, direct your emotion to specific areas of the things you're grieving about. So for example, during my dad's passing, the funeral, the way that the family, from my dad's side, the paternal side of my dad, the way they handled the funeral was so, I don't know how to say it. It wasn't nice. It wasn't nice. I think that they were just so self-centered and thought about themselves alone and what they could do, and it didn't really show any. I personally didn't just agree with that, with all the family stuff that was going on, and I was so angry, and I was able to direct my anger towards that part. So when I was grieving, I was directing my anger, and I remember saying to my therapist, I'm so angry at my dad's paternal family that we never even knew who they were, because dad never spoke about them, so I was so angry about that. That's where my anger was directed, because I just wanted us to bury, and it was during the COVID also, so it was so difficult to bury my dad, because it was during the COVID. There was just so many things going on, and whatever. It took me time to get over my emotions and just take it for what it is and just forgive them, but then that I knew that was where I directed my anger to. Another thing way of coping with grief is focus on positive memories of your loved one who has passed, or that relationship you've lost. What is when you were in that relationship that you've lost, what happened? What positive things can you say, okay, I want to focus on? You can do that. Identify, and also what it meant to you. Identify what it meant to you. What might make you not move on when you're grieving, and you get to that point where you want to move on from grieving. What do you think might make you not grieve, fully grieve to the stage where you want to move on? And also, it's good to also ask yourself, how long do you want to grieve for? Do you want to grieve for 15 years? Do you want to grieve for 10 years? What would your loved one have wanted you to do? What would your loved one or the person you're grieving for want you to continue grieving and not move on with your life? So those are some of the things that you can consider. Now, it doesn't mean that if you move on, that it's wrong for you to move on, because you still have your life to live. But everyone is different. You acknowledge that, okay, yeah, this person is gone. And sometimes it's also difficult for you to acknowledge that this person is gone. But whatever it is, whether you can acknowledge it or you can't acknowledge it, it's okay. I normally use this house of emotions that I created for my sessions. And I say to my clients, okay, when you're feeling sad, it's okay to feel sad, but also allow yourself to access other emotions that you normally would feel. So feel sad for a bit and go to those other emotions. So you could have a happy emotion, you can have a sad emotion, you can have a joyful emotion, or whatever, or an angry emotion, or you can have a surprise emotion or a joyful, whatever emotion that you experience in your daily life. Allow yourself to access all those emotions and not just focus on one emotions of the sadness, because that will help give you a break. Okay, above all, you know, I don't know, some people, it depends if you're spiritual, as a Christian. I'm going to talk from a Christian perspective now, and for this part, we depend on God, and we know when we lose someone, God is our comforter. The Holy Spirit is your comforter. So if you're a Christian and you are experiencing loss, I know how difficult it is, but don't forget that God is your comforter. The Lord comforts you. He knows what you're going through. Go to God for comfort and ask Him to comfort you. Ask the Spirit of God to comfort you. Okay? I pray that in the name of Jesus, the Lord will comfort you, and He will keep you, and He will protect you and guide you. And even as you're experiencing this loss, God will give you the strength to enable you come out of that grief. We do understand that where there is a beginning, there is an end. Yes, we will all leave this world one day, but it's sometimes very painful. It is painful when we lose a loved one or something that's precious to us. But I want to share with you today, and share with you that God cares. He cares. There's nothing we can do to turn back the time, and it's difficult. But allow yourself to process your feelings. Okay? You take care, and I'll see you in the therapy room. God bless.